Well, hello everybody and welcome to today's IEAGHG webinar. This webinar today is going to be covering the recent IEAGHG report on integrating CCS in international cooperation and carbon markets under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. My name is Samantha Neades. I'm Technical Programme Resource Manager at IEAGHG, and I'm pleased to welcome you all today from wherever you are in the world. Just a quick disclaimer slide that we need to show today. So IEAGHG are a technology collaboration programme and part of the International Energy Agency's Energy Technology Network. And we are autonomous from the IEA, and so any views expressed in this webinar do not necessarily reflect those of the IEA. Just a very quick overview of today's webinar. I'm going to start with a very quick introduction to IEAGHG and then give you a very brief study background. Tim Dixon, also from IEAGHG, is then going to provide a background and history of CCS in emissions trading schemes. And then Paul Zakkour from Carbon Counts will give you an overview of the study itself. So IEAGHG was founded under the IEA in 1991, and we are a member-based organisation. Our aim is to provide information on the role that technology can play in reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the use of fossil fuels and biomass in power and industrial systems, and our main focus is on CCS, or carbon dioxide capture and storage. We pride ourselves on producing information that is objective and independent, that is policy relevant but not policy prescriptive, and work that is reviewed by external experts. And the IEAGHG programme is able to do what we do thanks to our valued members. We currently have 37 members from all across the world, made up from countries, companies and organisations. So we help in many ways to initiate and develop knowledge transfer of information in different ways and through many different pathways, including through external involvement with initiatives as shown on this slide, and also through our primary or main activities. So far we've published over 360 reports on all aspects of CCS. Our international research networks span a wide range of areas and facilitate international collaboration and knowledge sharing. Events such as the Post-Combustion Capture Conference Series and also the GHGT Conference Series are very popular and well attended, with the GHGT Series having established itself as the principal international conference on greenhouse gas mitigation technologies, especially on CCS. And our well-known CCS summer schools have been running since 2007. And just a very quick look at some upcoming events in 2023. We've got our Risk Management Network coming up in June. Our 15th International Summer School is being held in Canada in July. Our Monitoring Network is being held in August. Our Offshore CO2 Storage Workshop in September. And then the 7th Post-Combustion Capture Conference is being held in late September. So it's a busy year for us on those activities. Please visit our website at IEAGHG.org if you want any more information on these upcoming events. And now on to today's webinar. So the contractors for this work were Carbon Counts, and we'd like to thank the authors of the report. So thanks to Paul Zakkour, who you'll hear from a little bit later, Greg Cook and Andrew Howard. And for your information, this study report is number 2023/01, and we published this in January this year. Just a very, very brief background. So the aim of this study was to review and summarise the recent and ongoing work in the area of CCS in an Article 6 context, and to provide a detailed overview of the subject. The study then aims to test these ideas to obtain more formal feedback and to review the practicality of different models and mechanisms that could be applied to CCS. The models investigated and evaluated covered a linked carbon pricing policies between countries, voluntary storage targets for fossil fuel producing companies, and a multilateral CCS club of parties to the Paris Agreement. And Paul's going to go into much more detail on this in just a little bit. And just a quick note on today's webinar procedures. So as attendees, your microphones and videos will be off throughout. Please don't try and turn your microphone on. If you do have a question for one of our speakers at the end of the session, please type your question into the question tab that you can see there on your control panel. So it's indicated by the red arrow here. We do have some time today to go through some questions, and we'll try and get through as many possible in the time that we have at the end of the event. Please note that this webinar is also being recorded and it will be made available on our YouTube channel shortly after the event. So now I'd like to pass it over to Tim Dixon, who is General Manager of IEAGHG. He's going to give us a little more information and history of CCS in the ETS.
Okay, thank you very much, Sam. Can I check that you've got my screen up?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So yes, it was thought that a brief history of the story of CCS in emissions trading schemes would be useful as further scene setting for this work that Paul and his colleagues have done. So this is a quick 10 minutes of a history lesson on CCS, primarily in the EU emissions trading scheme, because it was the world's largest scheme at the time, and it's still the largest compliance scheme now, and also in the clean development mechanism. So let me run through this quick history lesson in a sense. And it started really in 2004. Europe was looking at the introduction of the phase 1 of the ETS, and for the monitoring reporting guidelines, the MRG, that every activity sector needed. There was, at the UK's request, a possibility of including CCS as an option, as an interim, under consideration for the Commission and research to be submitted. So the UK government set up a group of experts, and credit here should go to Jeff Chapman, who was driving all of this. And Jeff organised a group of EU experts from across the EU member states and Norway, from both the governments and the geological surveys, and also carbon accounting experts and some CCS companies who are thinking of CCS projects, and also IEAGHG at that time as well. And this group looked at the basic fundamentals of how CCS could fit into a cap and trade scheme, such as the EU ETS. It looked at the boundaries that were required, and it's an installation-based scheme. But here we have a cap and trade scheme based upon emissions as installations, but not on pipelines for transport, not on geological storage sites. How to deal with those. And of course, how to deal with in the event of seepage, if there was leakage from any of those components, transport or storage sites. So this was really interesting thinking. We had lots of meetings of this group of experts, and the UK government then commissioned ERM and DNV to encapsulate all of this thinking into a set of recommendations, guidelines for MRG. And the lead author of that, by no coincidence, is Paul Zakkour, who's going to be presenting shortly. And so this first report was published in 2005, developing monitoring reporting guidelines for CCS in the EU ETS, UK government report R277. And this was quickly followed by, this established the principles and the rationale and the recommendations. And this was followed then by an actual template for MRG to be used for CCS. So this included recommendations such as separating out capture, transport and storage, because they could be under different operators in different jurisdictions, even in the UK case. Also recommended separate permitting regime for storage, because storage timescales are obviously longer than the ETS timescales. So in fact, it sowed the seeds for the CCS directive that then followed. Now, involved in this group as well was the European Commission, and they were also considering themselves the role of CCS in Europe as a mitigation option. So the European Climate Change Programme set up a working group 3 on CCS in 2006, looking at CCS in Europe, including whether it should be included in the ETS. It took the UK work, and we're now moving into phase 2 of the ETS, and there's an ability to opt in activities that weren't already included through Article 24. So the UK government proceeded to do that. It needed a real project. Thanks to BP, DF1 was the first project, and the Teesside Progressive Energy's Teesside project was the second. And the UK government proceeded to opt those in. The European ECCP work continued, and they contracted Ecofis to develop the MRG for the European Commission, building upon the UK's work. In the meantime, the UK drafted the MRG for these projects to go into phase 2 under Article 24. So all good work, and these reports are publicly available, and if you can't find them, ask IEAGHG. And what happened was, while the UK was in this process of applying under Article 24 for phase 2, the European Commission gained enough confidence from this work, the UK's work, the EU ad hoc group of experts, but also in other fora such as the London Convention's amendment for CCS and regulation and OSPAR amendment for CCS, gave confidence for the European Commission to propose CCS to be in fully in phase 3 for 2015. And so the ETS amendment in 2009 included CCS in fully, following the UK's recommendation on separation of capture plant, transport and storage. Transport at that point just covering pipelines. And the MRG were finished afterwards and issued in 2010, ready for CCS to be fully in from 2013. So that's all good, and those are the official journal documents. And at the moment this year, the Commission's looking at revising the MRG to include other means of transport such as shipping and also CO2 utilisation and also cross-border issues as well. So this was the history of CCS and the EU ETS. A lot of great thinking went on. IEAGHG captured some of that with the ERM, with Paul Zakkour in a report on permitting issues. But what was very important at the same time was the IPCC's greenhouse gas inventory work that it updates every 10 years was being updated. And in their energy volume, they were looking to include a new chapter on CO2 injection and storage. And the authors of that chapter coincided with the experts, some of the experts from the EU expert group. And so the thinking that had been going on in the EU was translated into the IPCC's greenhouse gas inventory guidelines, which have global application. So those processes I've just talked about, we summed them up along with the rationale for the recommendations made in 2 papers to IEAGHG conferences, GHGT 8, 2006, and then further on in the next conference, GHGT 9 in 2008. Now, these conference papers are normally available on Energy Procedure, except the first one, because back in those days, they were published on CD-ROMs. But if you want a copy of that first paper, just ask IEAGHG and we can send it to you. So just moving on to the IPCC guidelines for greenhouse gas inventories. They looked at the considerations, the realization that you can't have an emissions factor that you can with other activities for CO2 geological storage because of the nature of geology, the nature of the trapping mechanisms, the inability to predict seepage rates. And so they went for a tier 3 approach based upon measurement, as had the equivalent been done within the EU with the MRG. And so this tier 3 approach, this methodology of characterizing a geological storage site, characterizing the CO2 plume behavior, and then monitoring, and then reporting, this methodology became the underlying principles in all CO2 storage regulations that have developed since. So very significant. This also rolled over into the UNFCCC and the Kyoto Protocol with a clean development mechanism. In 2005 was considering the first 2 project applications. There was uncertainty about this mechanism for generating carbon credits from low carbon activities in developing countries. And this went on for some years because of some issues of concern. IEAGHG was inputting technical reports with ERM, with Paul Zakkour on methodology, CCS and the CDM methodologies, CCS market impacts in the CDM, and even inputting into the experts report that was commissioned by the CDM Executive Board. And these were the issues of concern across nations, the ones you might expect for countries newly thinking about CCS, plus the issue about long-term liability for the CO2. And the negotiations here are sort of consensus-based, and you need all countries to agree. So a few countries could hold things up, and as they were doing. It made progress 5 years down the line, thanks to the Mexican presidency of the UNFCCC that year, at a technical workshop in Abu Dhabi to address that list of issues of concern. It gave us, as IEAGHG, a chance to get our technical experts in to consider those issues with further information since the IPCC special report in 2005. And we really did address them adequately, or well, I think. And also with the CCS negotiators present, but in an environment where they weren't having to follow their lines and positions, it allowed them to ask genuine questions of genuine experts. And the end result was people were satisfied with the technical issues, and it just left the policy issue of long-term liability. And that enabled the UNFCCC Secretariat to develop draft rules for CCS, modalities and procedures. And the treatment of long-term liability is there in history, gives the host developing country two options. They take it on, generate normal credits, or they don't take it on. It goes with the owners of the credits, should there be seepage in the future. So it doesn't put any imposition on the host country. And this was accepted and negotiated, and that's a picture of the actual negotiations with me sat in the middle of the EU team there. So very important milestone for CCS, generating credits, carbon credits equal to those generated from other mechanisms for developing countries, and precedent setting for any international mechanism treatment of CCS. And again, the processes, the rationale and the results described in two conference papers in energy procedure from our conferences in GHGT 11 and 2012. Just continuing on with such interest in BECCS growing, we commissioned Paul Zakkour to further look at how you would treat negative emissions from BECCS, and that's in an IEAGHG report from 2014. And then to sum up all the developments across the world in CCS and emissions trading schemes, Paul produced a report for us in May 2016 that you can see there. So this is all background then that feeds into the current considerations that are going on in Article 6 and the specific piece of work on how CCS could fit into this international collaboration under Article 6. And that's the subject of this work and presentation today. So now I'll hand over to Paul. Paul Zakkour is the Director of Carbon Counts. He's been there for 14 years. He set this company up. He's obviously been involved in the area for a long time, from the number of times I've made reference to him to this point. And previously he was with ERM, and he's based in Germany, undertaking this work. So now I'd like to hand over to Paul to take us through the new work. Thank you, Paul.
Hello, everyone. Great to be here today. Thanks for the invitation, Sam and Tim. Just going to. Okay. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So yeah, I'm going to talk through a little bit about, try to encapsulate quite a lot of thinking in a very short space of time around all the different facets of Article 6 and some of the ideas floating around therein to incentivize CCS, but also more broadly geological storage activities, so encompassing some of those technological carbon removals such as direct air capture and BECCS or bikers that rely on geological storage. So firstly, thanks also to my co-authors Greg and Andrew and Samantha and Tim for their guidance in the work. So hopefully I'm going to do a good job of representing our collective views today. So those of you who don't know, Article 6 is really the foundation for an international carbon market that can allow parties to cooperate to meet their NDCs. Key point there being that the units transferred are supposed to be counted towards nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. And there are basically two components to Article 6. Article 6.2, which is what so-called voluntary approaches using internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, or IPMOs. So this is a very loose kind of clause about how parties can bilaterally or multilaterally join together to transfer units. And then Article 6.4 is much more about a sort of crediting, a new form of sustainable development crediting mechanism based on projects. And really that's sort of the idea in 6.4 was to recreate something similar to the clean development mechanism, but perhaps with a smaller scope of countries operating there under, and with the hope that more and more countries would migrate into 6.2 style cooperation with much more robust NDCs and not rely so much on the carve-out system of project crediting. And of course, what Article 6 does is give us an opportunity to think about the incentives or revisit some of the incentives and finance that can be available for carbon capture and storage and other geostorage activities. And the paper we were tasked with developing was to really address several key questions. So firstly, how might these mechanisms under Article 6 help to get wider deployment of CCS than was achieved under the previous mechanisms of the Kyoto Protocol, but also in places like the EU, where we did all that great work that Tim mentioned, dating back nearly 20 years, but yet we still haven't managed to get a project operating under that framework. What sort of models for cooperation could it facilitate as well, and how could that unlock some financing to support CCS deployment? And to what extent can these models confront and then overcome previous challenges to deploying CCS? So that was really our brief, and we tried to address it as best we could. But at the front end of the report, we really did a bit of a very quick literature review of the outlooks for Article 6 and some of the key factors therein. First, built around two basic building blocks: the types of carbon markets that may emerge in the future, and secondly, the types of units that could be used for transfers and offsets therein. And what that review told us was that cooperation might be implemented under a couple of ways. Firstly, through compliance markets, such as linking emissions trading schemes or carbon taxes, or through offsetting quotas like the CORSIA system for aviation, where everybody's operating against a cap that's agreed, it's UN regulated. And then there's the sort of voluntary market piece, where we have this demand coming mainly from corporate climate pledges, so voluntary pledges, and the acquisition and retirement of carbon credits thereunder to satisfy some kind of claims around climate neutrality. Well, I don't want to say climate neutrality, but certainly emission reduction, and then ultimately climate neutrality or net zero. And of course, that's precipitated a whole world of new activities under things like the VCMI and ICVCM to try and put further shape on how those claims can work and what's allowed and what's not allowed. But what we see at the current time is that there's quite considerable uncertainty around the roles and interactions between both these compliance markets and the voluntary markets. And we're seeing them sort of entwined a little bit, particularly the way CORSIA is heading, where it's allowing many sort of voluntary registry providers to generate and originate credits that can be used by airlines affected by CORSIA. So this is a UN-based system. And of course, we get into the much bigger questions about accounting and the types of units and the quality of units that can be used to offset, particularly under CORSIA rather, IKEA. So under Kyoto, the emphasis was very much on emissions reductions, but as Paris Agreement sort of builds in this concept of net zero, we see the emphasis shifting away from not only emission reductions, but also now onto removals by sink enhancement. So this hasn't really featured so much. I mean, so the crediting mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol did allow for afforestation and reforestation to generate credits, but it didn't really go very far because of the nature of the units that were generated. And also there was a lot of controversy around how parties to the Kyoto Protocol were using land-based accounting to essentially fiddle numbers to improve their net positions. So particularly around this gross net and net accounting and the optional opt-in of grasslands and croplands and everything else. So land use has always been a tricky area for accounting and crediting since the Kyoto days, and there's no necessary reason why it should be any different under Paris, because the same underlying science and challenges persist. So that will fold itself into now what is the idea of a balance of emissions and removals under net zero. So we're faced with a whole new set of accounting challenges, but in some ways those accounting challenges are not dissimilar to the challenges we faced before. So the current markets, carbon markets, include a mix of approaches and credit types, and there's limited distinction between the types as well. So we're never quite sure. I mean, whether reductions and avoided emissions and removals or a combination are embedded within a particular credit, because, you know, for example, some agricultural credits could include reduced fuel use from reduced tractor journeys or whatever. So there's a lot of different things going on in there that aren't necessarily always transparent to the buyer of the credit. So there does need to be a little bit more care around that. And then also, it's a little bit unsure what sort of claims a country can make that's acquiring Article 6 credits. So we see a lot of activity going on, particularly by Switzerland, who are buying in credits and signing bilateral agreements to source Article 6 credits from all kinds of places. But there doesn't seem to be any sort of agreement on what is an acceptable credit that counts towards any claims that Switzerland might make towards its climate neutrality goal. So what we are seeing, though, is a sort of sub-movement of some actors like Shopify, Stripe, Microsoft, Swiss Re, and also some credit generators like Puro Earth and Nori, who are all moving into exclusively trading of removal credits and acquisition and supply of removal credits. And then there are other questions that are in the policy agenda around mitigation deterrence. So if we persist with this focus on removals, are we forgetting to actually reduce emissions? And this has been coined mitigation deterrence by some observers. And then there's also the idea of whether we should start separating targets between removals and reductions. So those are some of the sort of backdrops that are ongoing in the sort of policy arena around Article 6. For this particular study, we zoomed also in a little bit much more on CCS and how that works under international cooperation. So if we look at most analysis that's around there on net zero pathways, we see that CCS is still a core part of that solution. So, for example, the IEA net zero scenario envisages, you know, at more than 7 gigatons of storage in 2050, coming from not just fossil fuel sources, but also increasingly from direct air capture and biogenic sources. And again, the IPCC scenarios from the special report on warming, which we used in this study because the AR6 results weren't out when we wrote this up, but if we can look at AR6 as well a little bit, and we see that it's still huge volumes, 13, 14 gigatons of geological storage in 2100. So depending on which scenario you look at. So clearly, geological storage and geosequestration and carbon capture are going to be absolutely essential to stabilize the atmospheric CO2 concentrations. So basically, Article 6 offers a variety of ways to incentivize these actions. Firstly, we can trade units based on the avoided emissions or removals from CO2 capture. What we can say is that very little CCS has been implemented under these sort of paradigms over the last 15 years. Maybe focusing the incentive on CO2 capture does pose challenges for how we get the rest of the system off the ground. The other way of looking at it is to perhaps look at more novel cooperation models that are out there in the literature. And unfortunately, my name is fingerprinted a little bit here because we wrote some of the ideas around with Wolf Heidelberg on the idea of a carbon storage club, a cooperation arrangement between countries that could focus just on storing carbon, and some also, but there's also a bunch of other ideas that building around a similar sort of time and on a similar sort of vein, like the carbon take-back obligation. And but they all have a common theme where we're built around the crediting of storage and the supply side, and geological net zero. So basically, we started off with these 2 points of departure for our study: the more traditional trading of avoided emissions or emission reductions and removals, and possibly the trading of carbon storage. So from that, we basically developed three basic archetypes or models. First one was model 1, the linked carbon pricing model. So entities target based on government emissions targets. It's a unified global marketplace. There's trading between businesses, but underpinned by government accounting. And we called this general model carbon reduction and removal units, CRRU. So the trading of units that are measured in emissions or removals. So all atmospheric accounting frameworks. And then we looked at two other alternatives. Model 2 was built around a voluntary storage targets for fossil fuel producers. So this was looking at major oil and gas companies in particular that have pledged to achieve net zero in 2050, and how we could define net zero for those firms, whether it could be a unilateral sectoral approach to offset production through the use of carbon storage units. So this is drawing on one of those novel ideas that I mentioned. And also when we were looking at this, we thought, well, can we sort of wedge in a sort of patchwork of national mandatory schemes? So this is really a sort of, we ended up with a 2A and a 2B a little bit, because it was saying, well, okay, we'd have companies doing unilaterally and voluntarily, but we'll also have some countries that are supporting that, particularly because of the interest around the North Sea basin in Netherlands at the time. Margaret Kuiper's work there, and some interest in the UK through Miles Allen, Stuart Hazeldine, and also some work that we've been in Norway. So we thought, can we put those two things together to make them work in a sort of system? The volume of carbon storage would be tied to company production and those pledges, and the origination of the carbon storage units would be governed by companies or countries, depending on which model we looked at. And then the third model we explored was this sort of much more sort of top-down government led initiative, taking some of the major fossil fuel producers and importers and trying to get them to club together to invest in carbon storage and have this carbon storage unit as a tradable sort of commodity that could be used to measure progress of the club. And this would, CSU origination in this arrangement would be governed under an international multilateral system. And so we took these three models, we described them in the report, and then what we tried to do was evaluate them against 5 criteria. How effective would they be? Do they maintain a high level of environmental integrity? Things like, do they avoid double counting? Do they achieve the outcome we want to achieve? The third one was financing. So can any of these models, how do these models compare in terms of their ability to finance and overcome some of the commercial barriers for CCS? Fourth one was progression. So do any of these models have advantages in terms of supporting the overall goal of the Paris Agreement, that is to come up with progressively more ambitious climate pledges from countries? And then policy performance was a bit of a general catch-all for anything else that wasn't covered by 1 to 4. So I'm just going to walk you through how the models sort of stacked up against those 5 criteria. So on the first one, effectiveness. So what we found was model 1, the sort of trading of carbon reduction and removal units, is highly uncertain because of the outlook for Article 6 at the minute. We've got this sort of mishmash of voluntary markets, emerging compliance markets, and tending to focus on this, what we're finding, just to use this graphic here from the Task Force for Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets report in 2021. This was their outlook for where the supply curve could come from for credits in the voluntary carbon market to 2030. I mean, it's quite bullish with this practical potential of 8 to 12 gigatons. What we can see there is actually nearly 4 gigatons is from what's called avoided nature loss, which we can assume is RED, a euphemism for avoided deforestation. And then another nearly 3 gigatons from nature-based sequestration. So this would probably be things like additional agriculture, forestry, and land use activities, afforestation, reforestation. And then 1 to 3.5 gigatons from technological carbon removals, so DACs and BECCS, that ended up with this 8 to 12. But in there is this small wedge of less than 0.2, which they called the current inventory. And it seemed from their analysis that CCS would only really fit in that wedge. So pretty much 200,000 tons of CCS by 2030 seemed a little bit small. And then, of course, what they did do was they scaled this back by 4 different criteria to end up with the actual realizable volume of 1 to 5 gigatons. So none of these look particularly promising, or the outlook doesn't look particularly promising for the voluntary carbon market, at least based on that analysis. There was another piece of work by Trove Research, which we cited, which was a bit more positive, which was more of a market sentiment survey. So rather than trying to do a quantitative study, it was much more speaking to providers and market actors to see what the direction of travel would be. And that was a little bit more positive on the potential for geostorage, but not particularly great. So then that gave us something to compare the models 2 and 3 against. And so here we did do some quantitative analysis around model 2. We looked at about 7 or 8 major oil and gas producing firms that have pledged toward net zero. We looked at their supply curve to 2050. We aligned that supply curve to the IEA net zero emissions oil and gas demand curve. So we can see in these grey wedges on the side here, model 2 is the energy company production under IEA net zero emission scenario. So we assumed that their current share of oil and gas supply would remain the same, but also a decline aligned to a net zero decline. And at the same time, what we then did was match that with a ratcheting demand for carbon storage units up to matching 100% alignment between carbon production and carbon storage. And what we found there was approximately a gigaton of carbon would be stored in 2050 if all those companies achieved that goal. When we expanded that to look at the model 3, which was the club approach, encompassing a far greater number of companies. So here we bring in the national oil companies, basically, for those countries that are supportive of CCS, and we get a much bigger share of the oil and gas park, up to about 4 gigatons stored in 2050. Excuse me. So if we reflect that back to the IEA net zero emission scenario, which envisaged about 7 gigatons being stored in 2050, the model 3 would get us somewhere to about over halfway towards that target, at least from fossil sources, of course. That was about, I think, about 70 or 80% of that 70 gigatons. So there's still some out there that isn't captured, even when we just look at the supply side of fossil energy markets. There's still some operators that would exclude coal, for instance, perhaps, or cement. But what we can see there is a far more promising outlook, at least, than perhaps the uncertainty in model 1. So for effectiveness in delivering permanent geological carbon storage, we rated model 2 and 3 a little bit higher than model 1 in terms of being effective in achieving that outcome. Obviously, other people might argue that's not an effective outcome. On the second criteria, environmental integrity, we didn't see any significant MRV issues for any of the models, but there were some accounting aspects that needed to perhaps be clarified around model 2 and 3 in terms of how do we inventorize carbon production, what sort of reporting standards could we use, which countries could originate carbon storage units, how would they be counted, and so on. So all those were discussed in the model. We also looked at double counting. There are some concerns if you originate 2 types of credits or 2 attributes from the same activity. So we have on the one hand the emission reduction, and on the other hand the carbon stored. Is there an integrity problem there? We found no, but we also looked a little bit at corresponding adjustments, because if carbon storage units were to be a transferable mitigation outcome, then we'd need to think about how the accounting would work there between countries. And then avoiding perverse incentive was another element of environmental integrity. We wanted to make sure that we didn't essentially create carbon lock-in. We discussed a bit around CO2 EOR. It's a little bit of a moot point, but it's we felt that because of the way that the mechanism works, by having the compliance point being the amount of oil produced or gas, then essentially each time you do EOR, you're just adding more to your compliance point, so you can store more carbon. So it's kind of a self-regulating model. On the third point, commercial and financial viability, I think this was a really important one that we haven't discussed enough, really, is we've seen these commercial challenges that have curtailed the anticipated scale-up of CCS in most parts of the world, things like volatile carbon prices or cross-chain risk between on the one hand, the entity that captures the CO2, and on the other hand, the entity that has to build a storage site and take the liability for that stored CO2. And we felt that Model 2 and 3 have some potential important benefits over Model 1 because of, if we can do them in parallel, we can have a carbon price and a storage price working in parallel. We might see a better alignment of interests across the value chain. Physical CO2 market starts to evolve based on the value of storage as well as the value of capture. Some better agency in the whole thing from storage operators, and so on. So I think this is quite an interesting area where a lot of moral hazards are baked in under current frameworks, and a lot of sort of standoffs and challenges to get these projects to the ground commercially. And we really feel like pricing storage could have a real benefit. So this is where I think Model 2 and 3 have some advantages. And then on NDC progression, we felt that Model 1 is very much a technology neutral mitigation approach, so carbon pricing optimized to clear at the lowest cost abatement method. And this didn't really offer a clear pathway for CCS deployment and financing. And in fact, that lack of pathway might lead countries to be conservative in their NDCs because they don't really have an idea how to mitigate fossil carbon in their economy. And so countries without any CCS experience might not commit to using it without a clearer support framework. And we felt that Model 2 and 3 could help drive greater ambition in NDCs compared to Model 1. So, we maybe were a little bit biased in our analysis there, but that was our feeling. It was very much based on our expert judgment, and it would be great to actually hear from a wider group on some of the views in this, and whether we're fair and objective in our analysis. And we also felt that when we looked at the transition to net zero, we felt that Model 2 and 3 could provide a coherent pathway for net zero policy design, because in some ways we see this progression away from just CCS into direct air capture and BECCS and carbon removals as being essential to offset diffuse sources of CO2 where you can't capture and store it. So, if you're producing carbon, for example, transport use, then the only way you can offset that is through direct air capture. And so this could be a way of closing that circle in a much more coherent way than relying on a more amorphous market where we've got a range of different technologies that may be doing that job. So we felt that carbon storage targets would be a good addition to the ambitious NDC toolbox. And then finally, policy performance was really about broad participation, coherence with other instruments, political economy, and so on. And we felt that the model could tick a lot of the boxes for all of those things. Sorry, just trying to get my screen to work here. So I won't go through this one, but simply just to move on and talk a bit about some of the key findings. So based on this very more detailed analysis, we basically concluded that without more targeted measures to support geological carbon storage, the outlook for CCS through conventional markets remains uncertain over the midterm. So, Article 6 cooperation probably not looking like it's going to be delivering a whole bunch of CCS before 2030. The implementation of a supply side offsetting approach is what we called a CSU type of model. If that operates in parallel with that conventional market, it can be effective in driving that cooperative action towards permanent geological storage of CO2. Basically, you've got another layer of finance in there, which brings those solutions down the cost curve as viable mitigation options. And we also felt that these approaches offered some of the potential to address issues for like NDC progression, address these commercial challenges, and offer strong sector alignment in policy design by basically getting the oil and gas industry on board to build and fill storage sites because it's in their interest to do so. At the time, Model 1 was really the only mainstream at the time of writing, which was, I think we finished this report almost a year ago. Model 1 was really just the mainstream policy approach on the table, and Model 2 and 3 were really just sort of niche areas of growing interest, but remained some way from implementation. And so the conclusion was that we need some more effort to raise awareness of the risks posed to net zero in the current market arrangements and have an opportunity to discuss these risks and address them through supportive policies such as CSUs. Now, what we can say is, as of last week, maybe the EU started to move a little bit with this Net Zero Industry Act. So Article 18 therein starts to talk about a carbon, I'm trying to think what it actually says now, it's gone from my head, but it's not an injection obligation, but at least available capacity obligation for the oil and gas industry. So we see a move to engage fossil fuel suppliers in the overall goal of CCS and geostorage. And secondly, maybe the COP28 presidency, being in an oil exporting country, might make moves with the CCS club idea. No idea, but if someone was going to do that, it would be great if the UAE would step up. So there's a couple of things that are sort of, we'd see some actually quite, it's less than a year since we finished this report, and these are two sort of major things to think about going forward already. So there is some traction growing interest and traction happening in political circles as well. So I'll leave it there, and we can move on to the discussion. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you very much, Paul. Very informative and in-depth in a short amount of time, so well done, thank you. So we do have a couple of questions coming in already, so if anybody else does have any questions, please pop them into that question tab and on your control panel, and I'll get to the first question. So this one asks, how impactful is the assumed CO2 price associated with the non-effectiveness of Model 1?
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, to be honest, we didn't do any primary analysis around carbon pricing. We just did a meta assessment of existing studies. So I couldn't tell you how sensitive the price was, but I imagine it was pretty sensitive. If we could, there was a graphic in the slide there showing the supply volume, but also the price in the VCM market, and clearly they've been trading at $2 or $3 a ton, which isn't necessarily going to do a lot for new CCS deployment today. So I guess, yeah, the CO2 price is absolutely critical. I think what I would add to that is that CO2 price alone doesn't necessarily control all the other risks for a financial investment decision making around the chain of CCS operations. So, we've seen carbon pricing notching 100 euros a ton in the EU ETS, but we don't see everybody suddenly switching on CCS plants, because we need that long-term price signal, not just a short-term spike. We need to see that consistently and repeatable. And that's always going to be a sort of lurking in the background, if you like, around those investment decisions. So it would be really helpful if we could sort of perhaps bring some certainty to those decision-making processes by making a mandate that requires people to actually build and store and build and fill geological storage sites at the same time. Then we can really see a real market for that physical CO2 developing. Hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And this next question asks, if for whatever reason there is not a decision to create CSUs as such by the Article 6 supervisory body, can we achieve what you are suggesting without the specific creation of CSUs?
Yeah, thanks, Lee. Nice to hear from you. Well, we've actually been doing a little bit of thinking about this internally in the last few months, about who needs to lead on what, because as you saw, we had these sort of two models in there, and in some ways there was three models, because we had this sort of voluntary pledge by industry, this sort of unilateral or plurilateral approach by a few countries, and then this very much more multilateral approach by more countries as a club. And I think really you can make a case for any of those groups to lead. So I think somebody needs to pick up the reins. So for example, you could see a voluntary system. There's nothing stopping companies that are in the fossil fuel supply business to set out their stall for this as a voluntary program, voluntary injection program, a VIP, for example, that could be measured and reported in corporate reports as a means to satisfy some climate-related targets and claims, for example. So, yeah, it's a difficult one to answer, but if the Article 6 isn't ready for that, which I sense it isn't, given the sort of challenges already in Article 6.4 around methodologies and removals, I think it's just another layer of complexity on their plate that they're probably not ready to deal with. So, yeah, my sense is that anyone can do it. But there needs to be a discussion about who actually wants to do this and who wants to lead on it. I think that's where we're heading at the minute.
Thank you. That questioner did also add great work, by the way, at the end. So just to add that in there. Okay, next question. Would the Model 3 pave the way so that Model 1 would be more effective for the CO2 capture side?
Yeah, thanks for that. I think yeah, the idea has always been that they would be mutually reinforcing. So if the CO2 price is not going to deliver, can the underpinning of a storage price also sort of pull through the CCS market as well as push it from the capture end? So yeah, hopefully the Model 3 would be a supplementary and complementary layer to the Model 1, rather than something that's completely independent, at least in the near term. Maybe over the longer term, we need to sort of have a look at how the two markets were functioning alongside each other and perhaps do something different. But I think that would be a nice problem to have, rather than something we need to worry about today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And this next one asks, if biogenic CO2 was captured in one country, but then stored in another, who would get the credit for that?
Depending on which model, but typically under Model 1, the organisation that captures the CO2 would gain the removal credit. So if that happened in country A, the removal credit would accrue to the company in country A, whereas the storage unit would be generated by an operator in country B. And I think what we're talking about here is that depending on which model, under Model 2, that storage unit would be acquired by a company to satisfy its own voluntary pledge for storage, or what. It really depends on which model, but nobody's claiming anything around the storage these days because nobody's got a storage target. So unless you have a target, there's no claim to be made. So we need to get somebody to commit to a target to store carbon, and then we can start having a conversation around the accounting and the claims. But I think that's the point I think I was trying to make earlier, a little bit about who's going to actually own this, run with it, lead it, and have a target and do all the accounting and the claims that go with it. So I think that's the kind of space we're sort of exploring a little bit at the minute.
Yeah.
Does that help?
I think that answers the question. Thank you. And we've got time for one or two more, so I'll delve right into the next question. So models 2 and 3 mainly rely on the IOCs and NOCs and their appetite to participate. How will the appetite of non-oil and gas emitters to reduce emissions impact the effectiveness of the 3 models presented? And would the impact be different among the 3 models?
Yeah, that's quite a complicated question. How would the appetite of non-oil and gas emitters to reduce emissions impact? Well, I think we're talking about, look, there's nothing stopping, well, apart from a few methodological barriers, there's nothing stopping somebody doing CCS or BECCS or DACS today and generating some credits from it. I mean, you can do it in North America. The American Carbon Registry has a methodology today. So, you know, whoever wants to do it can do it. I mean, it's a question about whether it's in their interest to do so, commercially or financially or reputationally. I think all we're trying to do is ask the question, what's the problem we're trying to solve? I think the problem we're trying to solve is really how do we get storage built? Because we've had a lot of talk about capture, but what we've never really talked about is how do we get storage done? And And moreover, how do we actually build the value? Can we actually build the value chain from the storage backwards? Maybe that's a mistake we made early on. We very much focused on carbon prices to push down the incentive to build the whole CCS chain. And maybe now we're exploring what problems might come up if we try from the other end, I guess. So, or can we do both? Can we cut with both sides of the scissors, really, on the emitter side and the storer side? I mean, you know, but I don't think there's any firm answers out there. I think we're all part of this conversation, and the more people are in it and the more people contribute to it, the quicker hopefully we'll get some really good answers and ideas out there. So great to ask these questions, but I can't answer that one so easily. So thanks.
Yeah, it's quite an in-depth question. It could take quite a while to answer that one. And we think we've got time. I think we just got one more on the list now. So is in the Article 6 report biochar also accepted as removals?
Well, I don't think we addressed that particular question, so I can't answer that, I'm afraid. But no. If you're talking about Article 6 more generally, I mean, I think, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think they're really grappling with what is an eligible removal at the minute within the Article 6.4 supervisory body. But certainly, I mean, look, Tim gave a really interesting presentation before me about all the extensive work that myself and Lee Salisbury, who's on the line, wasn't just me, it was Lee as well. It was a key part of that, my old boss. It took us 7 or 8 years to get CCS to a place where there was confidence that the science and the regulatory frameworks were sufficient to be comfortable that this was a mitigation technology that we could get to work. I'm still not sure we're quite there with some of these CDR technologies today, be it biochar or oceanic storage, because we don't have the frameworks over the regulation of the storage site and who's going to be liable and take on long-term liability for that stored carbon. All of those key questions really need to be hammered out to build confidence in the technology. So I know we're talking a lot about these things at the moment, but I sense that we need to sharpen up the messaging a bit more and sharpen up how we're going to address those problems a bit more. So yeah, it's an interesting time for sure.
Absolutely, that's great. And just in the interest of time, just because it's some of these questions coming in requiring quite long answers, I will draw this to a close now today. I think we've answered all of the questions we had in. So I'd just like to end this by saying a very big thank you to Paul and his co-authors at Carbon Counts for their hard work on this study and also on this presentation today. Thanks to Tim Dixon for the brief history lesson earlier on. Thank you very much, Tim. And thank you also to everybody who has joined us today from all across the world. You've got an international audience this afternoon or this morning if you're somewhere else in the world. And just to let you know that this report was made available. It was published in January this year, so just a couple of months ago. And as per all IEAGHG reports, for the first 6 months after initial publication, it's available to our members only. After 6 months, it will be made available to the general public. So this one will be released publicly in June this year. If you are interested in receiving a copy of the reports, please get in touch with IEAGHG. Go onto our website, IEAGHG.org, and quote report number 2023-01, and we'll be able to help you out with that. So again, thank you to our speakers. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Tim. And thank you to everybody for joining us today. Much appreciated.